The wind had teeth, and it had been chewing on her for the better part of a day. It howled through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods that lined the frozen creek bed, a mournful sound that seemed to pull the last dregs of warmth from her very bones. Snow, fine and sharp as sand, drove into her face, stinging her cheeks until they were numb and raw. Each step was a plunge into a cold, white oblivion that sucked at her worn-out boots, threatening to hold her fast and never let go. She had stopped feeling her toes miles back. Now, a dull, dangerous ache was climbing its way up her shins. She was 19 years old, though the cold had aged her, carving lines of desperation around her eyes and mouth that belonged to a woman twice her age. She had been walking since before the sun had risen, a pale, indifferent disk in a gray sky. And now that same sky was a bruised purple, bleeding into the black of a starless night. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. Just keep moving. The thought was a weak and flickering flame in the hollow of her mind. If she stopped, the cold would claim her. It was a patient hunter, and she was its tired prey. Then, a light. It was faint at first, a smudge of yellow against the oppressive dark, wavering in the gale. It was hope, so sudden and unexpected it almost brought her to her knees. A town, or at least a building. It didn't matter. It was a place where the wind wasn't. She fixed her eyes on it, a mariner spotting a distant lighthouse in a storm, and forced her leaden legs into a renewed, shuffling rhythm. The town, when she finally stumbled into what passed for its main street, was little more than a handful of false-fronted buildings hunched against the weather. 3 Rivers, Wyoming. The sign was barely visible under a crust of ice. It was a place built of necessity, not comfort, a temporary perch for men whose lives were spent in the vast, lonely expanse of the surrounding territory. The wind swept down the street, piling snow into drifts against the boarded-up windows of a mercantile and a blacksmith's shop. The only sign of life came from the largest building, the one with the yellow light spilling from its windows and a sturdy hitching rail out front where 2 horses stood blanketed and miserable, their heads bowed against the onslaught. A crudely painted sign swung and creaked on its hinges, the Rusty Spur Saloon. Pushing the heavy wooden door open took the last of her strength. A wave of heat and noise washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. It was the heat of a roaring fire, of too many bodies in an enclosed space. It smelled of wet wool, stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. For a moment, she just stood there, blinking, a wraith of snow and ice framed in the doorway. The low murmur of conversations faltered. Eyes turned toward her, curious, assessing, and mostly indifferent. It was a room of men, cowboys and ranch hands, their faces weathered and chapped, their shoulders broad under heavy coats. They were a landscape unto themselves, all hard lines and quiet resolve. Men who spoke little and saw much. They looked at her thin, inadequate dress, her face pale as bone, the way she trembled not just from cold but from a deep, soul-shaking exhaustion. And then most of them looked away, back to their cards or their glasses. She was not their business. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the howl of the wind. Her eyes went straight to the source of the heat, a large stone fireplace at the far end of the room, where flames leaped and danced, casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She wanted nothing more than to curl up on the hearth and let the warmth seep into her until she thawed. She made her way toward it, her steps unsteady on the wooden floorboards. She was aware of the eyes that still watched her, but she didn't meet them. She kept her gaze down, focused on her destination. "Ma'am?" The voice came from behind the bar. The bartender was a portly man with a graying mustache and tired eyes. He wiped a glass with a rag that had seen better days. "You lost." She shook her head, the movement small and stiff. Her throat was a raw, tight knot. "No," she managed to whisper, her voice a dry rasp. Could I just sit by the fire for a spell to get warm?" The bartender's expression didn't change. He'd seen all manner of desperate souls drift through these doors. "This ain't a church social. You buying something?" She flinched. She had no money. Not a single cent. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce, stubborn will to survive that was beginning to gut her out. She hugged her arms around herself, a futile attempt to stop the shivering that racked her body. "I don't have any," he grunted, his gaze dismissive, and turned back to his glasses. The message was clear. No charity here. A knot of panic tightened in her chest. To be sent back out into that wind, into that crushing cold, it would be a death sentence. She didn't move. She couldn't. She simply stood there, a few feet from the hearth, close enough to feel the ghost of its warmth on her frozen skin. She would steal what she could for as long as she could before he ordered her out. She found an empty stool near the end of the hearth, half hidden in the shadows, and sank onto it. She pulled her knees to her chest and held out her hands, her fingers white and stiff, her knuckles blue. They were like sticks of ice, devoid of feeling. Slowly, painfully, the heat began to prickle at them, 1,000 tiny needles that were both agony and relief. It was from this shadowed alcove that she first became aware of him. He was in the corner, deeper in the shadows than she was, a place the lamplight seemed to shun. She hadn't noticed him at first. He was as still as the wall he sat against. But now she saw him, a tall man, broad-shouldered, sitting alone at a small, scarred table. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat untouched before him. He wore a dark, heavy coat, and his hat was pulled low, obscuring most of his face. But what she could see was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. He was watching the room, but his gaze wasn't idle. It was the focused, patient gaze of a predator. There was a quiet intensity about him that set him apart from the other men. While they slouched and drank and spoke in low rumbles, he sat perfectly still, a pool of silence in the noisy room. The men gave his corner a wide berth. They would glance his way, a flicker of something respect, or perhaps fear in their eyes, and then steer clear. She heard one of the men at a nearby table lean toward his companion and mutter a name that was carried on the smoky air like a wisp of cold fog. Holt. Calder Holt. The name meant nothing to her, but she could feel the weight of it in the room. She watched him, unable to look away. He didn't seem to be paying her any mind. His attention was on nothing and everything at once. He lifted his head slightly to take a slow drink from his glass, and the firelight caught the side of his face. She drew in a sharp, involuntary breath. A scar. It was a pale, jagged line against the weathered bronze of his skin, starting at his right temple, slicing down across his cheekbone, and disappearing into the collar of his shirt. It was not a scar from a drunken brawl or a foolish accident. It was a vicious, deliberate mark, old and white and deep. It pulled the corner of his eye down ever so slightly, giving him a permanent expression of cold vigilance. It was a map of some past violence, a story written on his flesh, and it seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air around him. It looked as cold as the ice on the creek bed. She quickly lowered her eyes, a flush of shame heating her face. It was rude to stare, but the image of that scar was seared into her mind. It spoke of a pain she couldn't imagine, a hardness forged in a fire she couldn't comprehend. She understood, then, why the other men kept their distance. He was a man who carried his past on his face for all to see, and it was not a past that invited friendly company. She turned her attention back to her hands, rubbing them together, trying to work the life back into them. The warmth of the fire was beginning to penetrate her layers of cold, making her skin ache and itch. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound that her head drooped. She felt a cough building in her chest, a deep, rattling thing that started in her lungs and clawed its way up her throat. She tried to stifle it, pressing a hand to her mouth, not wanting to draw any more attention to herself. But it was no use. The cough exploded out of her, a racking, desperate series of gasps that shook her entire frame. It was a raw, wet sound that cut through the saloon's low drone. She doubled over on the stool, struggling for breath, her vision swimming with black spots. Each cough felt like it was tearing something loose inside her. When the fit finally subsided, she was left panting, dizzy and weak. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bartender to finally yell at her, to tell her to take her sickness and get out. The room had gone quiet. She could feel every eye on her now. She was an intrusion, a sick animal that had wandered in from the storm, and they were all just waiting for someone to put her out. She braced herself. But the bartender's angry voice never came. Instead, a different sound reached her, a soft, scraping noise on the wood of the table near her. She opened her eyes. A tin cup sat on the edge of the small table beside her stool. Steam was rising from it in a fragrant, beckoning cloud. It hadn't been there a moment ago. Her gaze traveled from the cup, across the few feet of empty space, to the man in the corner. Calder Holt. He hadn't moved from his chair. His hand was resting on his own table again. But she knew. He was the only one close enough. He was looking at her, his face still mostly in shadow. But she could feel the weight of his gaze. There was no pity in it, no kindness she could name. It was just a look, level and direct. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he turned his head and went back to staring into the fire, as if she no longer existed. He retreated back into his silence, into his fortress of solitude. She stared at the cup. It was hot tea. She could smell the faint, earthy scent of it. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her throat was on fire from the coughing, and the steam alone felt like a balm. But she hesitated. To accept it was to create a debt, a connection, however small, to this formidable, scarred man. Yet to refuse it was impossible. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The metal was blessedly hot against her frozen fingers. She drew the cup toward her, cradling it in both hands, letting the heat soak into her palms. She lifted it to her lips and took a tentative sip. The liquid was hot and sweet and strong. It flowed down her raw throat like a prayer, spreading a deep, calming warmth through her chest. It was life. It was a shield against the cold, against the bartender's scorn, against the lonely night. She took another, deeper drink, not taking her eyes off the man who had given it to her. He did not look back. He just sat there, a silent sentinel in the corner. A man marked by a past he couldn't hide and defined by an act of kindness he made no effort to claim. The scar on his face still looked as cold as the Wyoming winter, but the tea in her hands was warm, and for now, that was enough. She woke to a profound and unnerving silence. The world, which the night before had been a symphony of wind and rattling windows, was now utterly still, pale. Milky light filtered through the cracks of a high, warped wall, striping the dusty air with silver. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her body was a landscape of deep, settled aches, and a chill had seeped into her bones, a cold more patient and thorough than the wind's fury. She was lying on a mound of old, dry hay that smelled of dust and the ghosts of long-gone animals. Then it came back to her. The saloon, the fire, the scarred man in the corner, the cup of hot tea. She had no memory of leaving the saloon's warmth, no idea how she had come to be in this place. It was a stable, she realized, long abandoned. The stalls were empty, the mangers filled with cobwebs instead of feed. The air was frigid, but the thick wooden walls and piled hay had kept the worst of the night at bay. She sat up, a groan escaping her lips. Her head spun with a dizzying lightness. She was still weak, the hollow emptiness in her stomach a gnawing presence. As she moved to push herself to her feet, her hand brushed against something coarse and heavy. She looked down. Draped over her was a thick, dark wool blanket. It was an army blanket. She could tell by the rough weave and the faded letters U stamped near the edge. It was worn thin in places, but it was clean and heavy, and it was the only reason she hadn't frozen solid during the night. Lying beside it, placed carefully on a clean patch of hay, was a small, dense loaf of dark bread and a canteen of water. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the empty stable, her eyes searching the shadows. But she was alone. It had to have been him. Calder Holt. He must have brought her here after she'd fallen asleep by the fire. He had found her this shelter, given her this blanket from his own past, left her this meager, life-sustaining meal. He had done it all without a word. A specter moving through the night, providing for a stray he had no reason to care for. She picked up the bread. It was heavy, solid. She broke off a piece and chewed it slowly, the simple taste of baked flour and salt filling her senses. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. She drank from the canteen, the cold water soothing her raw throat. The simple act of eating, of quenching her thirst, felt like a resurrection. It stoked the tiny, flickering flame of her will to live, a flame that had nearly been extinguished. She didn't understand him. Men, in her experience, did not offer help without expecting something in return. Their kindness was a currency used to purchase compliance or affection. But this man had asked for nothing. He had given and then vanished. His presence felt only in the objects he had left behind. The gesture was as stark and unadorned as the man himself, as stripped of sentiment as the scar on his face. It wasn't kindness, not in the way she understood it. It was a provision, a practical act, like checking the cinch on a saddle or loading a rifle. He had seen a creature in need of shelter and sustenance, and he had provided it. That was all. Finishing the bread, she carefully folded the precious blanket and set it aside. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here, couldn't expect another act of silent charity. She had taken what was offered, and now she had to move on. Where? She didn't know, but she couldn't be a burden, especially not to a man who seemed to carry so many burdens of his own. She clutched the small, tattered cloth sack that held her only worldly possessions, a spare pair of stockings, and a small, smooth stone her mother had once given her, and walked toward the stable doors. They creaked open onto a world made new and blindingly white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow under a sky of brilliant, aching blue. The air was so cold it burned in her lungs. The little town of Three Rivers was quiet, plumes of smoke rising straight up from the chimneys of the few occupied buildings. Her stomach clenched with uncertainty. She took a step out into the snow, and a voice cut through the morning stillness. "There you are." She turned. Silas, the bartender from the saloon, stood in the street, his arms crossed over his thick chest. His face was set in a scowl, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Thought I was rid of you. This ain't a charity house for every drifter that blows in with the snow. Get along now. Town's got no room for vagrants." Rose froze. The words were like a slap. Vagrant, drifter. The labels stung, mostly because they were true. I was just leaving," she said, her voice small. "See that you do," he grumbled, taking a menacing step toward her. "We're a decent town here. We don't need your kind causing trouble." He was close enough now that she could smell the sour scent of old beer on him. He loomed over her, a fleshy embodiment of the world's indifference, her brief respite. The warmth from the bread and the blanket evaporated, leaving her cold and exposed once more. She took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had nowhere to go. To be cast out from this small point of civilization was to be sent back into the wilderness, a death sentence delivered with a casual wave of the hand. Panic began its icy crawl up her spine. It was then that another figure entered the scene. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was at odds with his size, emerging from the shadows of the blacksmith's overhang. Calder Holt. He wasn't looking at them, but he was walking in their direction, his long strides eating up the distance. The morning sun glinted off the barrel of the rifle he carried loosely in one hand. His hat was pulled low, but as he drew nearer, the light caught the side of his face. illuminating the stark, white line of his scar. Silas saw him, and the bluster seemed to drain right out of him. He visibly straightened up, his scowl morphing into a look of wary deference. He took a half-step away from Rose. Calder stopped a few feet away. He didn't acknowledge the bartender. His gaze, cold and gray as a winter sky, settled on Rose. It was an unreadable look, devoid of emotion, yet she felt pinned by it, as if he were seeing right through her skin to the frantic, frightened heart beneath. "This girl causing a problem?" Holt Silas asked, his voice suddenly attempting a tone of camaraderie that fell completely flat. Calder's eyes didn't leave Rose. The silence stretched, thin and tight. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath. Rose stood perfectly still, caught between the bartender's petty tyranny and the scarred man's unnerving quiet. Finally, Calder spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first time she had heard him say more than a single, muttered word. The sound seemed to come from deep within his chest, a thing not often used. He said only 4 words. "She is with me." It was not an explanation. It was a declaration, a statement of fact as solid and unchangeable as the frozen earth beneath their feet. The words hung in the frigid air. Absolute and final. Silas's mouth opened, then closed again. He looked from Calder's impassive, scarred face to the rifle held so casually in his hand, and whatever argument he might have considered died before it was born. He gave a short, jerky nod. "Right then," he mumbled, backing away. No trouble at all." He turned and retreated toward the saloon, casting one last, resentful glance over his shoulder before disappearing inside. The street was quiet again. Calder Holt stood there, a silent monolith against the snow. He looked at Rose, at her thin dress and her tattered bag, at the way she stood trembling. And then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible jerk of his head toward the end of the street, the direction that led out of town, into the vast, white emptiness of the plains. Then he turned and started walking. He didn't wait to see if she would follow. He didn't ask her where she was going or what she would do. He had claimed her, in a way, with those 4 words. He had taken responsibility for her in the eyes of the town, and now he was moving on. Rose stood frozen for a beat, her mind reeling. He was leaving. He was walking away. And she had a choice: stay here, where she was clearly unwelcome, and face the certainty of freezing or starving, or follow the silent, scarred man who had offered her shelter and sustenance, a man who was a complete and utter mystery, into an unknown future. From inside the saloon, she could see Silas watching through the window, talking to another man. She could almost hear the words they were saying, the story they were telling. They were talking about him. They'd say he was a former Army scout, one of the best, that he'd been with a cavalry unit up in the Bighorns a few years back, tracking a band of renegades. They'd walked right into a box canyon, an ambush, a slaughter. Of the 30 men who rode in, he was the only one who rode out, carrying that scar as a souvenir from a Cheyenne war lance. They'd say the things he saw in that canyon broke something inside him. He came back a different man, a ghost who kept to himself, a man nobody got close to. They'd say you couldn't touch him, not with a kind word, not with a friendly hand. His heart was as frozen and scarred as his face. She knew they were right. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the cold distance in his eyes. He was a dangerous man, not because he was cruel, but because he was empty. Following him was a fool's gamble. But he had left her the blanket, he had left her the bread, and he had spoken for her when no one else would. With a deep breath that crystallized in the air before her, Rose made her choice. She bent down, picked up the folded army blanket, and clutched it to her chest. She adjusted the meager sack on her shoulder. Her face, when she lifted it to look down the road where he was already receding into the distance, was a mask of utter exhaustion. But beneath it, in the set of her jaw and the unwavering focus of her eyes, was a core of pure, unyielding grit. She started walking, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, following the tracks of the man who had just saved her life. For the second time, they left the last meager structures of Three Rivers behind, and the world opened up into a terrifying and beautiful immensity. Before them lay a vast, unbroken sea of white, stretching to a horizon that was a mere smudge between the pale earth and the even paler sky. The land was not flat. It rolled in long, slow waves, the crests and troughs of a frozen ocean. The wind, now unobstructed by any building or bluff, became a living entity. It was a predator, sweeping down from the sharp, distant peaks of the bighorns, and it hunted them across the open plain. It had a voice, a low, constant moan that vibrated in the bones. And it had a bite, a sharp, surgical cold that found its way through every layer of cloth. Calder Holt rode a few paces ahead of her, a dark, solitary figure mounted on a powerful dark bay gelding. The man and his horse seemed carved from the same rugged material as the landscape itself. They moved as one, a single unit of purpose against the overwhelming emptiness. He did not look back. He faced forward, his hat pulled low, his shoulders set against the wind. He seemed to draw no comfort from the weak, watery sun that hung in the sky. Instead, he navigated by an internal compass, reading the subtle shifts in the land, the patterns of the wind-blown snow, the distant, skeletal shapes of cottonwoods marking a frozen riverbed. Rose followed in the tracks his horse left, a deep, clean furrow in the snow. It was a path, and she clung to the sight of it, a fragile thread leading her through the white wilderness. Her own boots, the ones she had worn for hundreds of miles, were a sodden, frozen ruin. They offered no protection against the snow that seeped in, chilling her feet to a state of painful numbness. Each step was an effort of will. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on her, slowing her movements, dulling her thoughts. The world became a simple, brutal rhythm: lift a foot, plunge it into the snow, drag it forward, repeat. The silence between them was as vast and profound as the landscape. Calder did not speak. Not a single word passed his lips for the first hour, or the second. The only sounds were the crunch of her own footsteps, the rhythmic, muffled plodding of the horse, and the ceaseless, scouring voice of the wind. At first, the silence was a heavy blanket, suffocating her with unanswered questions. Who was this man? Where was he taking her? What did he want? But as the miles fell away, the silence changed. It became less of an absence of sound and more of a presence. It was his language. It was the language of this land, a place where words were a frivolous expense, easily snatched away and lost in the wind. After a few miles, her legs, already taxed to their limit, began to betray her. She stumbled, her frozen ankle twisting, and she pitched forward, catching herself with her hands in the deep, powdery snow. The cold shocked her palms, a pain so sharp it felt like a burn. Instantly, the horse stopped. She looked up, panting, her breath a cloud of white in the air. Calder hadn't turned in the saddle, but he was aware of her. He was aware of the cessation of the rhythm behind him. For a long moment, he remained still, a statue facing the horizon. Then, without a word, his arm moved. A coil of leather rope, a lariat, unspooled from his saddle horn. He tossed the end of it back toward her. It landed in the snow just a few feet away. The message was clear, though unspoken. She stared at the rope, then at his unmoving back. He was not offering a hand. He was not offering sympathy. He was offering a tool, a practical solution to a practical problem. It was a lifeline, but one that kept him at a distance. She pushed herself up, her knees trembling, and staggered to the rope. She wrapped her cold, stiff fingers around the worn, smooth leather. It was cold to the touch, but it was solid. It was a connection. "Hop," he said, the single word a low sound, almost lost to the wind. The horse moved forward. and the rope grew taut in her hand. The pull was gentle but firm, enough to steady her, to give her an anchor against her own exhaustion. It made the walking easier. She no longer had to fight for every step. She was being drawn along in his wake. A small boat tethered to a larger, more powerful vessel. This became their new rhythm. They moved across the white expanse, linked by 6 feet of braided leather. Several more times her legs gave way, and each time the horse would stop, waiting patiently until she had regained her footing. Calder never turned, never spoke. He simply waited, his stillness a silent acknowledgement of her struggle. Before moving on, he seemed to possess an inexhaustible patience, the same patience as the mountains on the horizon, the patience of a thing that knows how to endure. They climbed into a stretch of low, rolling hills dotted with wind-scoured pines. The trees offered some small respite from the relentless wind, which now whistled and shrieked through their branches, a more frantic and menacing sound than its open plains moan. Here, the snow was deeper, forming drifts that came up to her waist. The rope became essential. There were times when she felt she was swimming more than walking, her body numb, her mind a dull, empty space where the only thought was to hold on to the leather lifeline. It was in these hills that she began to notice things about him, the way he guided the horse around treacherous, hidden patches of ice, the way his head constantly scanned their surroundings, his eyes missing nothing. From the fresh track of a rabbit to the distant shadow of a hawk circling in the vast, gray sky. He was a part of this place. He understood its moods, its dangers, its harsh, unwritten laws. He survived here not by fighting the wilderness, but by becoming as quiet, as vigilant, and as unforgiving as the wilderness itself. Just as she felt the last of her strength begin to ebb away, as the numbness in her feet began to turn into a terrifying lack of any feeling at all, they crested a final hill. Below them, nestled in a shallow bowl that offered some protection from the wind, was a cabin. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a small, stark structure of dark, weathered logs, chinked with mud that had long since frozen solid. A stone chimney stood at one end, and the roof was burdened with a heavy load of snow. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a place built for the sole purpose of keeping the elements at bay. It seemed to have grown out of the earth itself, as solid and enduring as the rocks around it. There were no other buildings, no fences, no sign of life but the thin curl of old smoke stain at the top of the chimney. As they approached, Calder untied the rope from his saddle horn and coiled it with efficient, practiced movements. The link between them was broken. She felt its absence immediately, a sudden return to her own profound instability. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and led the horse toward a crude lean-to that served as a stable. Rose just stood there, swaying on her feet, staring at the cabin door. It was a solid plank of wood with a simple leather latch. It promised shelter, but it was also the entrance to his world, his solitude. She felt like an intruder, a foreign element about to be introduced into a sealed and unchanging environment. He returned a few moments later, having settled his horse. He walked past her without a word and lifted the latch on the door. Pushing it open, he went inside, leaving the door ajar for her. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she followed him in. The inside was one room, and it was almost as cold as the outdoors. The air was still and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, the clean, sharp scent of pine. A deep, profound gloom filled the space, broken only by the gray light from a single, small window made of greased animal hide. The wind found its way through 100 tiny gaps in the log walls, and its mournful howl was now a constant, intimate companion. The cabin was stripped bare of anything but the most severe necessities. A narrow bunk was built into one wall, covered with a neat pile of furs. A rough-hewn table and a single straight-backed chair stood in the center of the room. A few iron pots and pans hung from pegs near the hearth. A rifle and a shotgun rested on a wooden rack above the door. There were no pictures, no books, no curtains, nothing to soften the hard, masculine lines of the place. It was the den of a solitary animal, a place for sleeping and eating, not for living. Calder had already moved to the stone hearth. He knelt before it, his back to her, and began the methodical process of building a fire. He moved with a quiet economy, his large hands surprisingly deft as he arranged the kindling and struck a spark from flint and steel. Rose remained by the door, afraid to move further into the room, afraid to make a sound. She watched the tiny spark catch on the tinder, watched it grow into a fragile, flickering flame. He nurtured it, adding larger pieces of wood, until the flames were leaping and crackling, casting a warm, dancing light that pushed back the shadows and chased the gloom from the corners of the room. The heat began to radiate outward, a living presence that was the absolute antithesis of the world outside. It was a miracle. Only when the fire was burning steadily did he seem to remember her. He stood and turned, his face illuminated by the firelight. The scar was a canyon of shadow on his cheek. His eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment. Then he looked down at her feet. She followed his gaze. Her boots were a disaster. The leather cracked and split, dark with melted snow. He looked at them for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he walked over to a small wooden chest in the corner, lifted the lid, and took something out. He came back and placed it on the floor near the hearth, not too close to her, but within her reach. It was a pair of men's work boots. They were old and heavily worn. The leather scuffed and softened with age, but they were solid. The soles were thick, and they had been well cared for, greased against the wet. Then he went to the bunk, pulled a thick gray blanket from the pile of furs, and folded it neatly. He walked to the single chair and laid the blanket over its back. And that was all. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if she was hungry or tired. He didn't touch her. He simply saw her needs warmth, dry footwear, another layer against the cold, and provided for them in the most direct and impersonal way possible. Having done so, he turned his attention back to the fire, taking up a poker to stir the burning logs. His duty, as he saw it, was done. He retreated back into his silence, leaving her standing in the growing warmth. A pair of old boots and a clean blanket waiting for her. Gifts given without a single word. The first days in the cabin passed in a thick, profound silence, measured not by the clock, but by the slow crawl of sunlight across the rough plank floor. A quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself between them. At dawn, Calder would rise from his bunk, the movement economical and silent. He would stoke the embers in the hearth back to life, put a pot of coffee on to boil, and then disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, rifle in hand. He would be gone for hours, checking trap lines or scouting for game, a solitary figure moving through a world of white and gray. Rose, left alone in the small, warm space, found her purpose in small, deliberate actions. She was a guest here, a stray he had taken in, but she could not be a simple dependent. Her gratitude was a restless thing, demanding to be expressed not in words, which she knew he would not welcome, but in deeds. She began to impose a gentle order on the cabin's stark masculinity. It was her way of paying a debt, of carving out a space for herself in his solitude. She started with the basics. She would sweep the floor, the soft whisk of the broom a comforting sound in the quiet. She found a block of lye soap and scrubbed the tabletop until the wood grain showed clean and pale. She scoured his few pots and the single skillet until they shone. These were small acts, but they were her own. They were a way of saying, "I am here. Thank you." He never acknowledged her work when he returned, his boots heavy with snow, his face ruddy from the cold. He would simply enter, hang his coat and rifle on their pegs, and accept the cup of hot coffee she would have waiting for him. He would drink it standing by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames as if searching for something in their depths. His silence was not menacing. It was a wall, thick and high, built of stones she could not name, and yet she noticed that his eyes, when he entered, would sweep the room, taking in the changes in a single, comprehensive glance. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the clean table. He saw, and he said nothing, which she began to understand was his form of acceptance. One afternoon, while he was out, she took his heavy wool coat from its peg. A seam under the arm had come loose, a long, ragged tear. She remembered seeing a small tin box on the mantel, and inside, she found what she was looking for, a packet of needles, a spool of thick, black thread, and a lump of beeswax. She sat in the single chair by the fire, the heavy coat draped across her lap. The garment smelled of him of pine smoke, cold air, and something uniquely masculine, like leather and earth. As she pushed the needle through the thick, coarse wool, her fingers clumsy at first, then finding their rhythm, she felt a strange sense of intimacy. She was mending the fabric that protected him from the brutal world outside. It was a small, quiet act of care, a stitch in the fabric of their strange, silent life together. She imagined him walking through the snow, the wind tearing at him, and hoped her stitches would hold, that they would offer some small measure of comfort. Another day, driven by a need to bring order to the last corner of the cabin, she turned her attention to the space beneath his bunk. It was cluttered with the detritus of a solitary life, a spare pair of worn-out boots, a coil of rope, and a jumble of cured animal pelts, beaver, fox, and wolf spilling from a canvas sack. She pulled them out into the light. The furs were beautiful, thick and luxurious. He was a good trapper. She began to fold them, smoothing the rich fur, stacking them in a neat, orderly pile. It was as she was sliding the last pelt back under the frame that her hand brushed against the hard edge of something else. Curious, she reached deeper into the shadows beneath the bunk. Her fingers found the rough grain of wood. She pulled it out. It was a simple wooden box, not much bigger than a book, held shut by a simple brass clasp. It wasn't locked, but it was hidden. This, she knew, was different from cleaning his pots or mending his coat. This was a deliberate intrusion into a place he had kept secret. Her conscience pricked at her. She should put it back, pretend she had never seen it. But the need to understand him, to find a single crack in the wall of his silence, was too strong. Her hands trembling slightly, she sat on the floor, placed the box in her lap, and lifted the clasp. The first thing she saw was a stack of letters, tied with a piece of faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age, the ink on the envelopes a faint brown. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. She carefully pulled one from its envelope. It began, "My dearest Calder." She read no further. It felt like eavesdropping on a conversation from another lifetime. She could smell the faint, dusty scent of dried flowers pressed between the pages, a memory of a long dead summer. Beneath the letters was a necklace. It was a delicate silver chain, now tarnished, with a small, heart-shaped locket. The chain was broken. One of the fine links snapped, as if it had been pulled off in a moment of anger or grief. It was a symbol of a promise that had been shattered. She held it in her palm, the cold metal a small, sad weight. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of velvet, was a photograph, a daguerreotype, its silvered surface capturing a ghostly, permanent image. It was a portrait of a young woman. She was not beautiful in the way of magazine illustrations, but her face was full of life. She had dark, kind eyes and a smile that was just beginning to form on her lips, a smile full of hope and unspoken affection. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a simple dress with a lace collar. This was the woman who had written the letters. This was the woman the broken necklace belonged to. This was the past he had buried under his bed. Rose traced the outline of the woman's face with her fingertip, a profound sadness welling up inside her. This was the life he had lived before the ambush, before the scar. This was the man he had been, a man who received letters filled with love, who gave silver lockets, who had the hopeful smile of a woman to carry with him. What had happened? Where had she gone? She was so lost in the ghost in the silver plate that she didn't hear the cabin door open. She didn't hear the soft crunch of his boots on the floor. The first she knew of his presence was when a shadow fell over her, blocking the light from the fire. She gasped, a sharp, guilty intake of breath. Her head snapped up. Calder stood over her, his rifle still in his hand. His face was a mask, impossible to read, but his eyes were fixed on the box in her lap, on the photograph in her hand. The silence in the room became a roaring in her ears. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She had been caught. She had violated the one thing he had, his privacy. She expected an explosion of anger, a harsh command to get out, to be cast back into the snow. She braced herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. But the anger never came. He just stood there, looking down at the relics of his past life spread out on the floor. A look of immense, soul-deep weariness settled over his features, deepening the lines around his eyes, making the scar on his face seem more prominent, more painful. He looked not at her, but at the face in the photograph. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, stripped of all emotion. She didn't wait. That was all. 3 words, but they held a world of loss and betrayal. They were the answer to every question she had. The woman with the hopeful smile had not waited for the soldier to come home. She had not waited for the scarred survivor who returned in his place. He moved past her, hung his rifle on the rack, and went to stand by the fire, his back to her, resuming his familiar post. The conversation, the longest one they had ever had, was over. Shaking, Rose carefully placed the photograph, the broken necklace, and the letters back in the box. She closed the lid, the soft click of the clasp sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. She slid the box back into its hiding place under the bunk, pushing it deep into the shadows where it belonged. That night, the chill returned. It started not from the outside, but from deep within her. The emotional shock of the afternoon, combined with the lingering effects of her long journey, had finally broken through her defenses. She lay huddled under her blankets on the floor near the fire, but she couldn't get warm. A violent shiver seized her, shaking her uncontrollably. Her teeth chattered, and the room began to swim around her. The firelight warped and twisted. The howling of the wind outside seemed to be inside her own head. She was burning up and freezing at the same time. She was vaguely aware of movement, of a large shadow looming over her. She felt a hand on her forehead, a hand that was surprisingly gentle. Through a haze of fever, she saw Calder kneeling beside her. His face, illuminated by the fire, was etched with a concern she had never seen there before. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a basin of water and a clean rag. He dipped the rag in the water, wrung it out, and gently placed it on her burning forehead. The cool cloth was a shock, a momentary anchor in the swirling chaos of her senses. He sat there with her, on the cold floor, for what seemed like hours. Every time the cloth grew warm from her fever, he would dip it in the basin again and replace it. He did not speak. He simply kept his vigil, a silent guardian in the flickering darkness. At one point, in her delirium, she felt a surge of fear, a primal terror of being alone in the dark, of being swept away by the sickness. Her hand moved, questing, seeking something solid to hold on to. Her fingers brushed against his. His hand was resting on his knee, large and calloused. Instinctively, her fingers closed around it. It was a weak, trembling grip, but it was a connection. She expected him to pull away, to recoil from the contact. He was the man no one touched. But he didn't move. His hand remained steady in hers, and what she felt surprised her, cutting through the fog of her fever. The skin was rough, calloused from work and weather, and on the back of his hand, she could feel the familiar, rugged terrain of another scar, a smaller cousin to the one on his face. But beneath the rough, damaged surface. His hand was warm. It was not the cold, dead thing she had imagined. It was a living human warmth, a steady heat that seemed to flow from him into her, a silent offering of strength and comfort. The scar did not feel like ice. It felt like part of him, and it was warm, clinging to that warmth. She finally drifted into a deep, healing sleep. The false spring arrived without warning. For weeks, the world had been locked in a state of suspended animation, frozen under a hard, white shell. Then, one morning, a different sound entered the cabin's silence, the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. The sun, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, had a touch of genuine warmth. By afternoon, the landscape was in the midst of a great, messy thaw. The pristine blanket of snow was collapsing into a pockmarked, slushy ruin, and the smell of damp earth and wet pine, long buried, was released into the air. Calder was outside, his back to the cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood echoing in the suddenly quiet air. He had shed his heavy outer coat, working in just his thick wool shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing sinewy, corded forearms. Rose watched him from the open doorway, a position she had taken to enjoy the novel sensation of a sunbeam on her face. A fragile domesticity had settled over them in the weeks since her fever had broken. It was a life built of silent routines and unspoken understandings. She kept the cabin. He provided. She made sure there was always hot coffee when he returned from the cold. He made sure the woodpile was never low. Words were not a part of their currency. Their communication was in a shared glance, a passed plate, the quiet presence of another human being in a world that had, for both of them, been crushingly empty. She was tracing a pattern on the doorframe with her finger when the sound reached her. It was a new sound, alien to their secluded valley. Not the crack of a falling branch or the cry of a hawk, but the wet, sucking sound of horses' hooves laboring through mud and slush. She saw the change in Calder before she saw the riders. His rhythm didn't falter. The axe rose and fell one last time, splitting a log with a clean, sharp crack. But then, instead of reaching for another piece of wood, he stood perfectly still, the axe held loosely in one hand, his head cocked slightly. His entire body had become an instrument of listening, of assessing. The easy posture of a man at work was gone, replaced in an instant by the rigid, coiled tension of a hunter who has just caught a dangerous scent on the wind. Following his gaze, she saw them, 3 riders, emerging from the line of dripping pines at the edge of the clearing. They were not cowboys. Cowboys rode with a certain loose-limbed ease, their posture speaking of long hours and open country. These men rode with a grim, forward-leaning purpose. Their clothes were a mismatched collection of practical, hard-worn gear, and the long barrels of rifles were nestled in saddle scabbards. Even from a distance, they radiated a quiet menace, a professional sort of ugliness. They reined in their horses 20 yards from where Calder stood, their animals breathing hard, sides heaving. The man in the middle, clearly the leader, was heavy-set with a thick, greasy beard and small, piggish eyes that took in everything: the cabin, the lean-to, and Calder himself. Rose's heart began a low, heavy drumming against her ribs. She saw Calder's hand, the one not holding the axe, flex and then relax. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but she had come to know his economy of motion. It was the movement of a man readying himself. He didn't turn to look at her, didn't give any sign he was aware of her in the doorway. His focus was entirely on the newcomers. "That's far enough," Calder said. His voice was not loud, but it carried in the still, damp air with the flat, hard authority of a rock striking steel. The leader smirked, a greasy shifting of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "We ain't looking for trouble, friend. Just passing through. Looking for someone." Calder didn't reply. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle, the axe still dangling from his hand. His stillness was more unnerving than any threat. He was waiting. The man's smirk faltered slightly in the face of that silence. He shifted in his saddle. "We're on business for Mr. Finch out of Colorado Springs. Looking for a girl. Name a Rose, skinny thing. Dark hair. You seen anyone like that?" The world seemed to tilt and shrink until it was nothing but the space between those men and the cabin door where she stood. Finch. The name was a key. Unlocking a room in her mind she kept bolted shut. A room filled with the cold dread of her immediate past. He had found her. After all these miles, after all this time, her flight had ended here. A wave of nausea and pure, icy terror washed over her. She felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the door frame to keep from falling. The leader's eyes slid past Calder and fixed on her. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, revealing a row of yellowed teeth. "Well, now, look what we have here. Saves us the trouble of asking again. Rose, honey, Mr. Finch sends his regards. He's missing you something fierce." Calder still didn't move. Rose could feel the tension radiating from his back, a palpable force. He was a stone wall, and she was standing behind it. "The leader, a man named Jedediah Kane," she now remembered with a shudder. Ignored Calder, his eyes still locked on Rose. "Mr. Finch is a reasonable man, but you took something that don't belong to you. Something important. He wants it back, and he wants you back to explain yourself." The lie was so bald, so familiar. The important thing was a set of legal papers, a fraudulent marriage contract Finch had used to control her and her family's small plot of land. The papers were her only proof of his deception, her only hope of ever being free. They were currently sewn into the hem of her dress. Calder finally moved. He turned his head just enough to speak to her over his shoulder, his voice low and urgent, a sound meant only for her. "Rose, get inside. Lock the door. There's a shotgun under the table. Hold on to it." It was not a suggestion. It was an order, a transfer of responsibility. The command cut through her panic, giving her a single, clear point of focus. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled back inside, her hands fumbling for the heavy wooden bar to slide across the door. It dropped into place with a solid, definitive thud. Outside, Jedediah Kane chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Now, that ain't very hospitable, sending the lady away. We just want to talk." He and his two companions began to dismount, their movements slow and deliberate, the confidence of predators who have their prey cornered. "I told you," Calder said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more dangerous than any shout. "That's far enough." As Kane's feet hit the muddy ground, Calder moved. It was not the move they expected. He didn't go for the pistol on his hip. He was too far away, and they were 3-1. Instead, he lunged forward, not at them, but to the side, putting himself squarely between the 3 dismounted men and the cabin door. He brought the axe up, no longer holding it loosely, but gripping it as a weapon. The fight exploded with a shocking, brutal suddenness. One of Kane's men, a lanky man with a knife already in his hand, rushed him. Calder met the charge, not with the blade of the axe, but with the heavy, flat back of it, a move designed to disable, not kill. The blow landed with a sickening crunch on the man's shoulder, and he went down with a scream of pain. But the move left Calder exposed for a fraction of a second. Kane was on him, a long, thin blade appearing in his hand as if by magic. He didn't slash, he thrust, a vicious, economical motion aimed at Calder's side. Calder twisted, trying to pull away, but it was too late. Rose, her face pressed against a crack in the log wall, saw the knife disappear into Calder's left side, just below the ribs. She saw the flash of surprise and pain on his face. She saw him grunt, a sharp exhalation of breath, as he staggered back a step. Inside the cabin, time had slowed to a crawl, following his order. Rose had dropped to her knees, her hands searching blindly in the darkness under the table. Her fingers found the cold, smooth steel of a double-barreled shotgun. She pulled it out. It was shockingly heavy, a dense, unwieldy piece of machinery. It smelled of oil and disuse. She had never fired a gun in her life. She scrambled to the greased-hide window, peering out into the chaos. She saw Calder stumble. She saw the dark stain spreading rapidly across the side of his shirt. He was hurt, badly. The third man was now circling around, pulling a pistol from his belt. Calder was trying to fend off Kane with the axe while keeping an eye on the man with the gun. He was trapped. He was going to die. He was going to die protecting her. Something inside her snapped. The terrified girl who had stumbled out of the snowstorm weeks ago vanished, consumed by a white-hot, protective rage. This man, this silent, scarred man, had given her shelter. He had given her warmth. He had stood for her when no one else would. And these men, these greasy, cruel specters from her past, were going to kill him for it. No. She moved from the window to the door, the heavy shotgun clutched in her hands. Her knuckles were white. Her mind was strangely, terrifyingly clear, with a strength born of pure desperation. She lifted the heavy wooden bar. The door swung open. The man with the pistol was just raising his weapon, aiming it at Calder's back. For a brief second, he was framed perfectly in the doorway. He heard the door creak and turned his head, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw her standing there, the twin muzzles of the shotgun leveled at his chest. She didn't aim. She didn't think. She pulled both triggers. The sound was apocalyptic, a deafening concussive roar that shook the very logs of the cabin. The recoil was a physical blow, a violent, brutal force that slammed into her shoulder and sent her staggering back, tripping over a stool and crashing to the floor. The cabin filled with thick, acrid white smoke that burned her eyes and throat. For a moment, there was a stunned, ringing silence. Then, she heard a shout of alarm from outside. Scrambling to her knees, she peered through the dissipating smoke. The man in the doorway was gone. Jedediah Kane and the man with the broken shoulder were staring, their faces a mask of shock and disbelief, at the empty space where their companion had been. Then they looked at the cabin, at the smoke pouring from the door, and then at Calder, who was leaning heavily on his axe handle but was still on his feet, his own pistol now miraculously in his hand. The fight was over. The odds had changed. Without a word, Kane and his injured man scrambled for their horses. They threw themselves into their saddles and spurred the animals mercilessly, galloping away, disappearing back into the pines, leaving the body of their fallen comrade lying in the mud. The silence that descended was absolute. Rose coughed, the smoke rasping in her lungs, and pushed herself to her feet. She stumbled out the door into the cold, clean air. Calder was still standing, but barely. His face was the color of ash. The pistol hung loosely in his hand. He looked at the fleeing riders. Then his eyes found her. There was something in his gaze she had never seen before. Not shock, not gratitude, but a deep, profound question. Then his eyes rolled back in his head. The pistol dropped from his fingers into the mud. His legs buckled, and he crumpled to the ground, landing in a heap in the slush and melting snow, the dark red stain on his side spreading like a terrible, final bloom. The world narrowed to the space of a few feet. There was the muddy, trampled snow, the still form of the man who had fallen, and the roaring silence that had followed the chaos. For a long, paralyzed moment, Rose could do nothing but stare at Calder, a collapsed heap of dark wool and pale skin. The blood from his side a vivid, obscene red against the melting white. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, a ghost of the violence that had just transpired. Then, a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through her shock. He was alive. His chest was moving, a shallow, ragged rise and fall, but he was unconscious, bleeding, and lying in the wet cold that was a killer in its own right. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. Panic was a luxury. It was a weakness she could not afford. The same cold, clear resolve that had made her lift the shotgun now guided her hands. Getting him inside was a task of nightmarish difficulty. He was a big man, a dead weight of solid muscle and bone. She was not strong. She hooked her hands under his arms and pulled, her boots slipping in the slush, her muscles screaming in protest. She strained, grunting with the effort, dragging him inch by painful inch across the muddy clearing and over the threshold of the cabin. It was a desperate, ugly struggle that left her gasping for breath, her arms and back burning with a fire of their own. She managed to get him onto the thick bear hide in front of the hearth, his head cushioned on a rolled-up blanket. She slammed the door shut, barring it again, sealing them inside their makeshift hospital. The body of the man she had shot lay outside. A problem for another time. A problem for a world that still existed beyond these four walls. Right now, only Calder mattered. With shaking hands, she lit every lamp in the small cabin, chasing the shadows into the corners. She needed to see how bad it was. She took a deep breath and began the terrible work of cutting away his blood-soaked shirt. The knife wound was a deep, vicious gash in his side, oozing dark. Steady blood. It was clean, at least not ragged. A thrust from a professional hand. She remembered seeing him stitch a tear in a leather harness once, his movements economical and precise. She found his kit, a small tin containing curved needles, waxed thread, and a flask of whiskey. She knew what she had to do. The knowledge came from a place of primal necessity, the things a woman on the frontier had to know to survive. First, she cleaned it. She poured a generous amount of the raw, fiery whiskey directly into the wound. Calder's unconscious body arched in a silent scream of agony, a purely reflexive response to the searing pain. A low groan escaped his lips. Rose flinched, tears stinging her eyes, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Calder," but her hands remained steady. She cleaned it as best she could, her stomach churning, her mind a block of ice. Then came the needle. Her first stitch was clumsy, hesitant. The act of pushing a needle through a man's living flesh was a violation. But as the edges of the wound began to pull together, a grim determination took over. She worked by the flickering lamplight, her world shrinking to that small, terrible canvas of skin and blood. She stitched him up as she had stitched his coat, her movements becoming more sure, more practiced, with each pass of the needle. When it was done, she bandaged him tightly with strips torn from one of her own few clean garments. His breathing was shallow, his skin unnaturally pale beneath its weathered tan. A fever was already beginning to radiate from him, a dry, dangerous heat. She covered him with every blanket and fur she could find and then collapsed into the chair beside him, her body trembling with a combination of exhaustion and delayed shock. The long vigil had begun. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of quiet, desperate work. The world outside ceased to exist. Her universe was the small, dim cabin, and its center was the still, silent man on the floor. Time was measured in the slow changing of his bandages, the boiling of water, the low crackle of the fire that she never allowed to die. The silence was absolute, broken only by his shallow breathing and the sound of her own voice. She began to talk to him. At first, it was just to hear a human sound, to push back the oppressive quiet that felt like a shroud. But soon, it became something more. It was a confession, a conversation, a tether to keep him anchored to the world of the living. "The snow is almost gone from the south-facing slope. Calder," she would murmur, sponging his face with a cool, damp cloth. "You can see the grass. It's brown, but it's there. A promise." She told him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. She told him about Finch, about the cloying, false kindness that barely concealed a predator's greed. She told him about her escape, the long, terrifying nights spent hiding in barns and ditches. "I wasn't brave," she whispered to his sleeping form one long night, the wind howling outside. "I was just more scared of him than I was of starving. You're the first person who hasn't looked at me and seen something to take." She tended to him with a devotion that went beyond mere gratitude. It was a fierce, protective instinct. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into a saloon. She was the guardian of this man's life. She was the keeper of the flame. On the third day, a new presence appeared. A boy, no older than 13 or 14, materialized at the edge of the clearing. He was thin and wiry, with a shock of sandy hair and the wary, watchful eyes of a wild creature. He stood there for a long time, just looking at the cabin, at the unnatural stillness of the place. Rose saw him through the window, and her first instinct was fear. But the boy made no move to approach. He just waited. Finally, she unbarred the door and stepped outside, her hand never far from the shotgun leaning against the wall. The boy took a step back, his eyes wide. "What do you want?" Rose asked, her voice raspy from disuse. Is Mr. Holt all right?" the boy stammered. "I ain't seen his smoke for 2 days." Rose's defensive posture softened. "He's hurt. He's inside." The boy's gaze darted from her face to the dark, ominous shape still lying in the mud a few yards away, now partially covered by a dusting of new snow. He swallowed hard but didn't ask. He was a boy accustomed to the harsh realities of this land. "My name's Tom," he said. "I live over the ridge. Mr. Holt. He helps me sometimes, with my snares. He brought me flour last fall." Here was the proof of it. Another act of silent, practical kindness. Calder's charity was as quiet and hidden as the man himself. "I can help," Tom said, his eyes now looking past her into the dim interior of the cabin. "The wood pile's low. I can chop for you. And bring water." Rose felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had been so focused on Calder that she hadn't realized how low her own resources were getting. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The water bucket was nearly empty. She had been trying to do it all, and she was failing. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please." Tom became her silent partner in the vigil. He never asked what happened. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. He chopped wood with a quiet efficiency, the rhythmic sound of his axe a welcome heartbeat in the still air. He hauled buckets of water from the creek, his thin frame straining with the effort. One day, he brought 2 rabbits, already skinned and cleaned, and left them on the doorstep without a word. Rose made a thin, nourishing broth, and for the first time she was able to spoon a few drops between Calder's dry, cracked lips. They worked together in the shared, unspoken understanding of 2 people fighting a common enemy. The enemy was the fever, the infection, the cold hand of death that hovered in the corners of the room. The fever peaked on the 5th night. Calder's skin was on fire, his breathing a harsh, rattling sound in his chest. He began to mutter, incoherent words from a past she couldn't know. Names of men, the name of a place, Box Canyon. He thrashed, his powerful body fighting against invisible demons. It took both Rose and Tom to hold him down, to keep him from tearing his stitches. They spent the night bathing him in cool water, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. 2 sentinels guarding a flickering soul. Toward dawn, the fever broke. The heat receded, leaving him drenched in sweat, his breathing finally evening out into a deep, quiet rhythm. Exhausted, Tom went back to his own small cabin over the ridge, promising to return later. Rose, drained and weary, slumped into the chair by the hearth, her head falling back as she drifted into a shallow, dreamless sleep. She awoke to the feeling of being watched. The sun was streaming through the window, a bright, hopeful light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. The cabin was warm and quiet. She sat up, her neck stiff, and looked toward the bear hide on the floor. Calder was awake. His eyes were open, and they were on her. They were clear, the fever haze gone, and they were filled with a profound, soul-weary quiet. His gaze held hers across the space of the room, an exchange of 1,000 unspoken words. She saw the question there, the confusion, the weary disbelief. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping whisper. He licked his lips and tried again. The words were so quiet she had to lean forward to hear them. "I didn't think you'd stay." It was not a question. It was a statement of his deepest, most fundamental expectation. The expectation of abandonment. The scar on his face, the letters in the box, the wall he had built around himself. It was all there in those 5 words. He had expected to wake up alone, or not at all. He had not expected her to still be here. A small, sad smile touched Rose's lips. The answer came to her not from her mind, but from a place deeper, a place of newfound certainty. She had been passed from her father, to Finch, to the mercy of the trail. She had been an object, a burden, a problem to be solved. But here, in this cabin, tending to this broken man, she had made a choice. She looked into his clear, gray eyes and gave him the only truth she had. "No one ever asked me where I wanted to go." His return to the world was a slow, quiet dawn. There was no single moment of dramatic recovery, but rather a gradual reclaiming of himself, one painful, deliberate movement at a time. The first time he stood, leaning heavily on the table and the back of the chair. His face was a mask of pale, sweat-sheened concentration. He was a mighty tree that had been felled, and now had to learn to grow toward the sun again. Rose was his constant, silent support, always there with a steadying hand on his elbow or a cup of broth, her presence as quiet and essential as the air he breathed. The cabin, once his solitary fortress, had transformed. It was now a shared space, filled with a new kind of silence. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the full silence of companionship, of 2 people moving in a shared orbit, so attuned to one another that words were often unnecessary. The unspoken question of her departure hung in the air for a day or 2, and then, without any discussion, it simply dissolved. She had stayed through the crucible of his fever. She had faced down the ghosts of her past to protect him. Her staying was now a fact as solid and real as the log walls of the cabin itself. As his strength slowly returned, a new chapter began. It was a time of rebuilding, not just of a man's broken body, but of a life that had been left to go fallow. Their work was a quiet, parallel poetry of recovery and creation. Calder, as soon as he could walk without swaying, turned his attention to his fences. The winter had been hard, and a long section of the fence line that marked the boundary of his small horse pasture had collapsed under the weight of the snow. His first day of work was a trial. Rose watched from the doorway as he moved with a frustrating slowness, his body still a stranger to him. Every post he had to set, every wire he had to stretch, was a monumental effort. He would work for an hour and then have to sit on a stump, his head in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the wound in his side a hot, angry reminder of his limitations. She would bring him water without being asked, and he would take it without a word of thanks. But his eyes would meet hers for a brief moment, and in that shared glance, everything was said. She saw his frustration, his fierce pride battling with his body's betrayal. He saw her quiet, unwavering support. He was a man who had never accepted help, and he did not know how to ask for it now. But he was learning, slowly, how to receive it. Day by day, he grew stronger. The line of new fence posts grew longer, a testament to his returning power, a neat, orderly stitch healing the wounded land. He was reestablishing his boundaries, not to keep the world out, but to create a safe space within. While Calder mended the outer edges of their world, Rose began to cultivate its heart. A short distance from the cabin, on a patch of ground that caught the morning sun, she decided to make a garden. The idea was an act of pure, audacious hope. She had no tools but a rusty spade she'd found in the lean-to and her own 2 hands. Young Tom, who still visited every few days, brought her a small, precious packet of seeds beans, squash, and corn that his own mother had saved. She turned the dark, rich earth, her hands sinking into the cool soil. The work was hard, her back ached, and her palms blistered. But it was a good, clean pain. It was the pain of creation. With each stone she removed, each clod of earth she broke apart, she felt as if she were clearing a space in her own soul, a place where something new could grow. She was not just planting seeds in the ground. She was planting herself, putting down roots in this wild, lonely place. For the first time in her life, she was not running from something. She was building toward it. Calder would sometimes stop his own work and watch her from a distance, a still figure leaning on a post-hole digger. He would watch her kneeling in the dirt, her face smudged, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a look would come over his face that she could not quite decipher, a mixture of wonder and a deep, quiet tenderness. Their evenings fell into a gentle rhythm. After a simple meal, he would work on his leather, mending a bridle or oiling his saddle, his large hands surprisingly nimble. Rose would take up her sewing, with thread from his tin and a piece of soft, bleached flour sack. She began to make a new handkerchief. It was a small, simple thing, but she took great care with it, her stitches small and even. The tiny, repetitive motion was a form of meditation. As she sewed, she would sometimes feel his eyes on her. She would look up and find him watching, his own work forgotten, a strange, soft light in his gray eyes. They were learning the topography of each other's silence. One morning, after he had gone out to the fence line, she took his clean work shirt from the peg where it hung. There was a patch near the collar where she had mended a tear weeks ago. Her stitches were neater now. Beside the patch, she carefully placed the newly finished handkerchief, folded into a neat, white square. It was a silent offering, a gesture that was both deeply intimate and incredibly shy. She felt a blush creep up her neck as she did it, as if she were confessing a secret. She said nothing about it. She simply left it there and went about her morning, her heart thumping with a quiet, nervous anticipation. He came in for his midday meal, and she busied herself at the hearth, her back to him. Suddenly unable to look at him, she heard him move toward the peg, heard the rustle of the shirt. A long silence followed. She held her breath. Had she overstepped? Had she tried to place a soft thing in a world that was all hard edges? When she finally gathered the courage to turn around, he was standing by the open door, looking out at the mountains. Around his neck, tied loosely, was her white handkerchief. He wasn't using it to wipe his brow or blow his nose. He was wearing it, openly, a stark slash of clean white against the weathered skin of his throat. He hadn't hidden it in a pocket. He had claimed it. He had taken her small, quiet gift and placed it where the world could see it. He turned, and his eyes met hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It was everything. The final wall came down a week later. Calder's recovery was nearly complete, but the wound still pained him, and his movements were sometimes stiff and awkward. He was attempting to shave, standing over a basin of hot water with a straight razor in his hand. His left hand, the one on his injured side, was not as steady as it should be. The razor slipped, and a thin line of red appeared on his jaw. He swore under his breath, a low, frustrated growl. Rose, who was kneading dough at the table, turned at the sound. "Here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Let me—" He started to protest, the reflexive pride of a self-sufficient man. "I can manage." "You're bleeding," she said simply, wiping the flour from her hands. "Be still." To her surprise, he didn't argue further. A look of weary resignation passed over his face, and he handed her the razor, then sat in the chair. She dipped a clean cloth in the hot water and knelt before him. The position was a strange reversal of the night of his fever, when he had knelt before her. Now, she was the caregiver, and he, the patient. She gently wiped the blood from his jaw. Her movements were slow. "Careful. You should have asked," she murmured. "Not used to asking," he rumbled, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. "I know," she said. She took the warm, damp cloth and began to wash his face, gently wiping away the last of the shaving soap. It was the most intimate act they had ever shared. Her fingers traced the hard line of his jaw, the surprising softness of his earlobe, the weathered creases around his eyes. He sat perfectly still under her touch, his body rigid, a wild animal allowing a human hand on it for the first time. And then her fingers, of their own accord, drifted upward. They found the beginning of the scar at his temple. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, with a feather-light touch, she began to trace its path down his cheek. She felt the tissue, no longer angry and red, but a pale, silvery landscape of raised, smooth skin. She was not touching a wound. She was touching a story. She was touching his pain. The moment her fingers made contact with the scar, she felt him freeze. A tremor went through his entire body. His jaw clenched, and the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. His eyes, when they met hers, were no longer soft. They were shields of ice. The look of a man retreating deep inside himself to a place of old, familiar pain. It was a look that said, "Do not touch me here. This place is mine alone." Her hand stopped. She did not pull away. She simply held her fingers there, a warm, gentle pressure on the mark of his deepest trauma. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering acceptance. She was not afraid of this part of him. She was not repulsed by it. She was simply with him. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The ice in his eyes held, a barrier of frozen grief, and then, slowly, miraculously, it began to melt. The hard lines of his face softened. The tension in his jaw eased. His eyes cleared, and what was left was a raw and unguarded vulnerability. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. His voice, when he spoke, was a rough, quiet whisper, barely more than a breath. "It doesn't hurt anymore." He wasn't talking about the feel of her fingers on his skin. He was talking about the ambush. He was talking about the letters in the box. He was talking about the woman who didn't wait. He was talking about a pain he had carried for so long it had become a part of his own anatomy. Rose looked at him, at the truth shining, clear and undeniable, in the depths of his gray eyes. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips. "I know," she whispered back. And she did. She believed him completely. The scar was still there, a map of where he had been, but it was no longer the destination. It was just a part of him, a part that, under her touch, had finally found its peace. The gentle, tentative spring gave way to a summer of brutal, uncompromising heat. The sun was no longer a welcome visitor. It was a tyrant that reigned from a brassy, cloudless sky. The land, which had so recently woken up, was now being baked into submission. The creek that ran through the valley shrank to a thin, sluggish trickle. The grass in the pasture turned a brittle, thirsty brown, and the dark, rich earth of Rose's small garden grew a cracked, pale crust. The air was thick and still, smelling of hot dust and parched pine needles. It was a season of endurance, a time when life huddled in the shade and waited. With the heat came the rumors. They drifted in on the hot wind, carried by the few souls who traveled the high country. Young Tom was their first messenger. He arrived one scorching afternoon, his face flushed, his horse lathered in sweat, carrying a small sack of salt and a heavy load of news from the settlement down below. "There's a man," he said, gulping down the water Rose gave him. "A rich man from back east, name of Redding. They say he's buying up everything, every ranch, every claim, from here to the Bighorns. Says he has paper from the railroad." Calder, who was repairing a stirrup leather in the sliver of shade by the cabin wall, didn't look up from his work, but Rose saw his hands go still for a moment, the awl held motionless above the leather. She had learned to read his stillness. It was a sign of deep, focused attention. "They say he's got men with him," Tom continued, his boyish voice full of a grim excitement. "Not cowboys. Hard men. They say you don't take no for an answer." Calder resumed his work, punching a neat hole in the leather. "There's always a man like Redding," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble. It was the fatalistic tone of a man who had seen the same story play out a dozen times in a dozen different territories. A story of money and power flowing in to crush the small, stubborn lives that had claimed the land first. The rumor became a reality 2 weeks later. Calder rode out one morning to check his snares near the spring that fed their creek, the only reliable source of water for miles. He was gone longer than usual. When he returned, his face was set in hard, grim lines. The scar on his cheek stood out, a pale, angry mark against the dark tan of his skin. "What is it?" Rose asked, her heart a cold knot in her chest. "The spring's been dammed," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Diverted. They used rocks and felled timber. A thorough job." It was a declaration of war, delivered not with a bullet, but with the slow, deliberate sentence of thirst. It was an attack on their very ability to exist in this valley. Without that water, the garden would die, the horse would weaken, and they would eventually be forced out. "Redding's men?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and began to unsaddle his horse. His anger was a palpable thing, but it was a cold, controlled fury, the anger of a strategist, not a brawler. For the next week, he and Tom labored from sunup to sundown, digging a new, deeper channel from a smaller, less reliable seep high up the ridge, a back-breaking effort to secure a trickle of life-giving water. The final escalation came on a moonless, suffocatingly hot night. They were jolted from sleep not by a sound, but by a smell, the sharp, acrid scent of smoke, and through the greased hide window, a flickering, demonic orange light danced against the pines. "The lean-to," Calder breathed, and he was out of his bunk and through the door in a single, fluid motion, grabbing his rifle as he went. Rose was right behind him, the small, crude stable. The first thing Calder had built on this land was engulfed in flames. The fire roared and crackled, a hungry beast devouring the dry timber, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. Calder's horse, its eyes wide with terror, was rearing and plunging at the end of its tether, trapped. Without a thought for the heat, Calder ran toward the inferno. Rose saw him pull a knife, saw the flash of the blade as he sawed through the thick rope halter. He slapped the horse's flank hard, sending it galloping off into the darkness. Safe. He stood for a moment, silhouetted against the fire, a solitary figure watching a piece of his life burn to the ground. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, he scanned the dark tree line, his eyes searching for the men who had done this, men who were likely watching from the shadows. But there was nothing. The arsonists had done their work and vanished, leaving the fire to deliver their message. They could do nothing but watch it burn. By dawn, all that was left was a pile of blackened, smoking timbers and the lingering, bitter smell of ash. The message was clear. "We can touch you whenever we want. We can destroy whatever you build. Leave." The fire seemed to burn something in Calder as well. The quiet, watchful peace he had found over the spring and summer was gone, replaced by the old, familiar ghost. The ghost of Box Canyon. Rose saw it in the way he moved, in the cold, distant look in his eyes. He was retreating, pulling back into the hardened shell of the survivor. He spent the morning methodically packing a single saddlebag. He moved with a grim, purposeful calm, folding a spare shirt, checking the action on his pistol, gathering a small supply of dried jerky and hardtack. He was not panicked. He was preparing. Rose watched him from the table, her hands clenched in her lap. "What are you doing?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "There are other places," he said, not looking at her, his voice devoid of emotion. "Further west, better water." The words hit her like a physical blow. Running. After all of this, after the fence and the garden, after the quiet intimacy they had built, his answer was to run. "So, we're just leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and a rising, defiant anger. "We're letting them win." "This isn't a fight we can win, Rose," he said, turning to face her. His face was a mask of weary resolve. The scar was a stark reminder of what happened to men who stood and fought against impossible odds. "It's 3 of them, maybe more. It's Redding and his money. It's the railroad. This is just land. It's not worth dying for." Something inside her, something that had been dormant for her entire life, finally broke free. The fear, the habit of submission, the instinct to flee it all burned away in a flash of pure, clarifying rage. She stood up, her small frame radiating a strength he had never seen before. "It's not just land," she said, her voice low and fierce. "It's the fence you built and the garden I planted. It's the roof that kept me from freezing and the stitches that held you together. It's our home." He stared at her, his expression unreadable, a flicker of something surprise, pain in his eyes. "You've been running your whole life. Calder," she went on, the words tumbling out, words she hadn't even known were there. "You ran from the war. You ran from that box under your bed. You've been hiding from everything out here. Well, I've been running my whole life, too. From my father, from Finch, from being hungry and cold. I'm done running. I'm not running from this." She stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing, daring him to contradict her. She had just held up a mirror, and in it, he saw not the capable, self-sufficient survivor he believed himself to be, but a man ruled by ghosts. She saw him, all of him, and she was not turning away. He looked at her, at the fierce, beautiful defiance in her face. Then his gaze moved past her, around the small, rough cabin. He saw the neatly stacked wood pile, the clean scrubbed table, the white handkerchief, now washed and folded, sitting on the mantel. He looked out the open door at the neat, hopeful rows of her garden, struggling but still alive in the heat. She wasn't just a stray he had rescued. She was a force of life that had taken root in his barren world and made it bloom. She was right. This was home, and men, real men, did not run from home. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, the breath of a man letting go of a burden he had carried for a decade. The ghost in his eyes receded, replaced by a clear, cold light, a decision. He walked over to the saddlebag and deliberately unpacked it, placing the shirt back in the chest, the jerky back in the larder. Then he picked up his rifle and began to clean it with methodical, deadly purpose. The next day, Tom was sent out as a messenger, not with news of defeat, but with a call to arms. He rode to the few other small homesteads scattered through the high country to the Millers, a quiet family with 3 young sons, and to old Jedediah, a grizzled prospector who lived in a dugout and valued his privacy above all else. They gathered at Calder's cabin that evening, a small, grim-faced assembly of stubborn, independent people. Calder, standing before them, was a changed man. He was no longer the silent recluse. He was the scout, the leader, his voice quiet but clear as he outlined a plan. They were outnumbered, but they knew the land. They would not be driven out. The confrontation came 2 days later. 5 of Redding's men, led by a burly, confident foreman named Cobb, rode into the clearing. They rode with the arrogant swagger of men who expected no resistance, their mission simply to deliver the final notice and, if necessary, to burn the cabin to the ground. They reined in their horses, and Cobb unfolded a piece of paper. "This is a legal eviction notice," he bellowed. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects and vacate the—" He never finished the sentence. From the rocks above the cabin, Jedediah's voice, raspy from disuse, crackled through the air. "I'd reconsider that if I were you, friend." Cobb's head snapped up. On the ridge to his left, Mr. Miller and his 2 oldest sons rose from behind a stand of aspen, rifles held steady. To his right, Tom, his face pale but determined, appeared from behind a fallen log, holding an old but well-maintained shotgun. Cobb and his men were surrounded. Their confident smirks vanished, replaced by looks of disbelief and dawning fear. They were no longer facing a single, broken-down recluse. They were facing a community. One of the younger men, his nerve breaking, fumbled for his pistol. It was the mistake Calder had been waiting for. From the dark, open doorway of the cabin, Calder's rifle cracked, a single, sharp report that echoed through the valley. It was not a killing shot. The bullet slammed into the wood of the young man's saddle horn, a hand's breadth from his stomach, sending splinters flying. The man yelped and dropped his pistol as if it were a hot coal. The message was as clear as the fire had been. "We are still here. We are not afraid. And we do not miss." Cobb looked from the splintered saddle to the determined faces on the ridges, to the cold, deadly calm in Calder Holt's eyes. He was a bully, not a general. This was no longer a simple eviction. It was a battle, and he was not prepared to fight it. He spat on the ground, his face a mask of frustrated fury. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was empty. He wheeled his horse around, and he and his men rode out, not with a swagger, but with the hurried, resentful retreat of defeated men. A ragged cheer went up from the Millers. Jedediah cackled from his perch on the rocks, but Calder and Rose just stood, watching until the riders were gone. The valley was quiet again. The immediate threat averted, they had won. They had stood their ground. Together. Calder turned and looked at Rose, at the dust on her cheek and the fierce, proud light in her eyes. He looked at the blackened timbers of the lean-to and the hopeful green of her garden. He had been ready to abandon it all, to run back into the solitary wilderness that was his only known refuge. But she had shown him a different kind of strength. Not the strength to endure alone, but the strength to stand together. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "We're not running anymore," he said, and it was not just a statement, it was a vow. The departure of Redding's men left a silence in the valley that was deeper and more profound than any they had known before. It was not the silence of isolation, but the resonant, peaceful quiet of a sanctuary successfully defended. The threat had not simply vanished, it had been met, and it had been broken against the unified will of a few stubborn souls. The victory settled over the land, as tangible as the golden light of late summer that now slanted through the pines. The peace they had found was no longer a fragile, accidental thing. It had been forged in fire and fear, and it was theirs by right. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of a quiet, settled permanence. The days were no longer about mere survival, but about the slow, deliberate act of building a home. There was no discussion of the future, no promises made, no talk of preachers or papers. They did not marry. A ceremony of words felt flimsy and unnecessary next to the powerful, unspoken vows they had already made to each other in the sharing of bread, in the tending of a wound, in the deafening roar of a shotgun fired in defense of a life. Their commitment was not a document to be filed away, but a living thing they nurtured with every sunrise and every sunset. Their love was a language spoken entirely in gestures, a series of quiet, daily rituals that held more meaning than 1,000 flowery speeches. Each morning, just as the sky began to soften from black to a deep, bruised purple, Rose would rise. She would stir the fire and put the coffee on. And then, when Calder was dressed and ready to face the day, their first ritual would take place. He would sit in the chair, his back to her, and she would take up a comb carved from bone. His hair, which he had always kept tied back in a simple, functional thong, had grown long and thick over the months. She would comb it out, her movements gentle and sure, undoing the tangles from the previous day's work and sleep. The strands were heavy and clean, smelling of the pine soap she now made and the wood smoke that clung to everything in the cabin. Then she would gather the dark mass of it in her hands, her fingers brushing against the warm, strong column of his neck. He would sit perfectly still, his head bowed slightly, a gesture of profound trust from a man who had never before allowed anyone to stand behind him. She would tie it back neatly with a strip of clean leather, her touch a silent blessing, a final moment of shared peace before he went out to engage with the hard, demanding world. It was her way of sending him out with her touch upon him, a quiet claim that he was hers, and that he would return. He would go out then, to the endless work of the homestead. He rebuilt the lean-to, not the crude structure it had been, but a solid, sturdy stable built of notched logs, strong enough to withstand the heaviest winter snows. He extended the fence line, his movements regaining their old, powerful grace. He hunted and trapped, keeping their larder full. And in all his work, there was a new sense of purpose, the purpose of a man building not just for himself, but for a future that now included another. Rose, in turn, found her domain in the cabin and the small plot of earth beside it. Her garden had survived the heat and the conflict, and now, in the gentler autumn sun, it thrived. She harvested beans and squash, storing them for the coming winter. The sight of the shelves, slowly filling with the fruits of her labor, gave her a deep, quiet satisfaction she had never known. This was hers. This was the first place on earth she had not been simply trying to survive, but where she had actively nurtured life. And every evening, when the last light had faded from the sky and the hard work of the day was done, it was his turn. While she tidied away the last of their simple supper, Calder would heat a kettle of water over the fire. He would pour the steaming water into a small wooden basin, adding a handful of the wild herbs she had gathered and dried, which released a fragrant, soothing scent. He would place the basin on the floor in front of the hearth, and then the single chair. "Rose," he would say, the only word needed. She would come and sit, her body tired, her muscles aching from a day of hoeing, carrying water and chopping vegetables. She would lift her skirts slightly, and he would kneel before her. He would gently remove her worn, sturdy boots, the very ones he had given her so long ago, and her stockings. Then, with a tenderness that still astonished her, his large, calloused hands that could split a log with a single blow or aim a rifle with deadly precision, would gently cradle her feet and place them in the warm, fragrant water. He would wash them carefully, his thumbs working the knots out of her tired arches, his fingers gently cleaning the garden soil from beneath her nails. He was washing away the evidence of her labor, of her journey. He was tending to the very feet that had, by some miracle, carried her out of a blizzard and into his life. It was an act of quiet, humble reverence. It was his way of saying that he saw her weariness, and that he would care for it. He was a man of few words and no poetry, but in this simple, nightly act, he showed her a devotion more profound than any sonnet. They never spoke the word love. The word felt too small, too common for the vast, quiet thing that had grown between them. Their love was in the extra blanket he placed over her on a cold night, and in the way she mended a tear in his shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. It was in the way he would leave a perfect, shining river stone on her pillow, and in the way she always saved him the last, best piece of cornbread. It was in the comfortable, easy silence they shared by the fire, two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found their other half in the wilderness. The summer's heat finally broke with the first rain of autumn. It came one afternoon, not in a violent thunderstorm, but as a soft, steady, whispering fall that blurred the sharp edges of the mountains and filled the air with the clean, rich scent of wet earth. They stood together under the small overhang of the porch he had built, watching the rain darken the soil of her garden. It was a peaceful, contemplative moment, the world outside turning gray and soft, enclosing them in their own small, safe universe. Rose leaned her head against his chest. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm that had become as familiar and comforting as her own. She could feel the solid warmth of him, the sheer, undeniable reality of his presence. He rested his chin lightly on the top of her head, one arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the gentle drumming of the rain on the roof. "Calder," she said, her voice a murmur against the fabric of his shirt. She thought back to the night of her fever, to the moment she had reached out in the dark and found his hand. She thought of the day she had finally dared to touch the mark on his face. She understood, now, that those had been the moments when everything had changed. "If I hadn't touched the scar," she whispered, the words coming from a place of deep, quiet certainty, "you might never have let me stay." He was silent for a long moment. The rain whispered around them. She felt the slow rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. He did not ask what she meant. He did not need to. He understood the intricate, unspoken language of their shared history perfectly. When he finally answered, his voice was a low, rough sound, full of a raw, unguarded truth that made her heart ache. "If you hadn't touched it," he said, his arm tightening around her, "it might still hurt." The seasons turned, each one leaving its mark on the small valley, each one deepening the quiet contentment that had settled in the cabin. The fierce, defiant summer bled into a gentle, golden autumn. The aspens on the high ridges turned to shivering coins of gold, and the air grew crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and curing hay. They harvested the last of the vegetables from Rose's garden, the shelves inside the cabin now a comforting mosaic of preserved life, a bulwark against the coming cold. Winter arrived not as an enemy, but as an old, familiar acquaintance. The first snow fell softly, muffling the world in a blanket of pristine white. This time, there was no fear in the silence, only a deep, restful peace. They were prepared. The stable Calder had built stood strong and solid. The woodpile was a small mountain against the cabin wall, and the larder was full. The days grew short, the nights long, and they passed them in the warm, flickering light of the hearth. A small, self-contained world of two. In this world, Tom had become a permanent fixture. He was no longer just the helpful neighbor boy, but an integral part of their lives, a bridge between their quiet solitude and the future. He was the son neither of them had ever expected to have. Calder, in his patient, silent way, taught him things a boy needed to know to survive in this land: how to read the tracks of a deer, how to set a snare that was both quick and humane, how to mend a harness with a sailor's sturdy stitch. Rose, in turn, gave him things he had lost with his own mother. She taught him his letters in the evenings, her finger guiding his over the pages of a tattered almanac. She mended his worn-out clothes, her stitches neat and strong, and always made sure there was an extra biscuit or a piece of dried apple for him to take on his way home. He brought a youthful, boisterous energy to the homestead, the sound of his laughter as he helped Calder with the chores, a bright, cheerful note in the valley's quiet symphony. He was their living testament that life, once defended, would flourish. One afternoon in the early days of the following spring, as the last of the snow melted and the land awoke, green and new, Rose found herself alone in the cabin. Calder and Tom had ridden out to check on the Miller family over the ridge. A rare, profound stillness settled in the room. The sun streamed through the open door, illuminating the familiar, beloved space, the clean-scrubbed table, the neatly made bunk. the rifle resting on its pegs. It was a place of such profound peace. It was hard to remember it had once been a refuge of lonely survival. She thought of her journey, of the desperate, half-frozen girl who had stumbled out of a storm. She had been a blank page then, a story of nothing but flight and fear. Now, she was someone else entirely. She was a woman who knew the satisfaction of a harvest, the weight of a shotgun, the geography of a man's scarred face, the deep, quiet rhythm of a life truly lived. On the small mantel, next to the white handkerchief she had made for him, was a small bottle of ink and a few sheets of precious paper Calder had gotten in trade for some beaver pelts. Moved by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she sat at the table, dipped the pen, and began to write. It was not a letter to anyone, not to a past she had left behind or a future she could not see. It was an attempt to give voice to the great, silent transformation that had taken place within her. "I used to think a home was a place with a roof and a door," she wrote, the pen scratching softly in the quiet. "A place you were from, but I was from nowhere, and I was going nowhere. I was just a leaf in the wind. This cabin, which was your fortress against the world, became my first anchor. The work you taught me with my hands, planting a seed and watching it grow, became the first prayer I ever truly believed in. They say the wilderness is a place of hardship and survival, and it is. I have felt its teeth. But it is also a place of truth. There are no lies in the turning of the seasons, no deceit in the ache of tired muscles. Out here, a person is stripped down to what they truly are. I was stripped down to nothing but a will to live, and you had been stripped down to a memory, a scar you carried on the outside to match the one you carried within." She paused, looking out the door at the greening valley. She thought of his face, of the moment her fingers had finally traced that jagged, white line. It was the key. It was the moment the lock on both their hearts had finally turned. "The day I touched your scar, I didn't know I was also healing myself. I thought I was just touching a wound, but I was touching a story. And in accepting your story, I was finally able to start my own. The girl who was running died in this valley. The woman who stands in her place is not afraid anymore. She knows that the deepest wounds are not the ones that leave a mark on the skin, but the ones that convince us we are destined to be alone. You have shown me that is the greatest lie of all." She did not sign it. She simply folded the paper and left it on the table, not hidden, but not presented. It was a truth that now belonged to the cabin itself, a part of the air they both breathed. The story ends not with a great event, but with a quiet evening, one of many just like it. As the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks, the sky was a masterpiece of soft pink and deep orange, the light casting long, gentle shadows across the valley. Calder and Rose stood together, leaning against the top rail of the pasture fence, the one they had defended. The wood was smooth and warm beneath their hands. A few yards away, Tom was engaged in a comically serious effort to herd their small flock of chickens back into their coop for the night. The hens, stubborn and witless, scattered in every direction, and Tom, laughing, would dart after them, his young legs a blur of motion. It was a scene of such simple, perfect domesticity. It was almost painful in its beauty. No words passed between Calder and Rose. There was no need. They watched the boy, their boy, and then their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw it all. She saw the memory of the cold, silent man in the corner of a saloon, the fierce protector who had stood between her and death, the patient invalid who had let her care for him, and the man who now stood beside her, his heart as open and peaceful as the valley before them. And in her eyes, he saw his own salvation. He saw the half-frozen girl he had pitied, the stubborn woman who had nursed him back to life, the fierce warrior who had stood in the doorway with a shotgun, and the gentle soul who had planted a garden and taught him, finally, how to put down roots. He saw the woman who had touched his scar and had not flinched, and in doing so, had given him back his own life. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the mountains, plunging the valley into the soft, purple twilight, his hand found hers on the fence rail. It was not a tentative, questioning touch. His large, calloused hand closed over hers, his fingers lacing through hers, a firm, solid, and certain grip. It was a hold that spoke of permanence, of a bond that had been tested and had held. It was the anchor she had written of, a safe harbor at the end of a long and desperate storm. They stood there together, hand in hand, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. The scars were still there, the pale, silvery line on his face, and the invisible latticed network of them on her heart. But they were no longer marks of shame to be hidden away in the dark. They were not reminders of pain, but of survival. They were the strange, jagged maps that had, against all odds, led them to this exact spot, to this exact moment. They were the proof that the deepest wounds did not have to leave a person alone. Sometimes, they were the very things that helped them find their way home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.